Good evening, everyone. This is a quiz. What is different about tonight? Keshava. Keshava is with us to chant a little bit before we begin, which is used to be common and is now unusual. So I at least am glad of it. I hope you are too. So let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your living presence within us, that we may be guided and inspired in all ways by your love, by your compassion, by your joy. Om. Peace. Amen.
sing thy name, I will drink thy name, and get all drunk, oh, with thy name. I will sing thy name, I will drink thy name, and get all drunk, oh, with thy name. Om Guru, Om Guru, Om Guru, Om. Om Guru, Om Guru, Om Guru, Om. Om Guru, Om Guru, Om Guru, Om. I will sing thy name, I will drink thy name, and get all drunk, oh, with thy name. I will sing thy name, I will drink thy name, and get all drunk, oh, with thy name. Om Guru, Om Guru, Om Guru, Om. Om Guru, Om Guru, Om Guru, Om. I will sing thy name, I will drink thy name, and get all drunk, oh, with thy name. I will sing thy name, I will drink thy name, and get all drunk, oh, with thy name. Om Guru, Om Guru, Om Guru, Om. Om Guru, Om Guru, Om Guru, Om. I will sing thy name, I will drink thy name, and get all drunk, oh, with thy name. I will sing thy name, I will drink thy name, and get all drunk, oh, with thy name. Om Guru, Om Guru, Om Guru, Om. 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 I will sing thy name, I will drink thy name, and get all drunk, oh, with thy name. I will sing thy name, I will drink thy name, and get all drunk, oh, with thy name. I will sing thy name, I will drink thy name, and get all drunk, oh, with thy name. Om Guru, Om Guru, Om Guru, Om. Om Guru, Om Guru, Om Guru, Om. Om Guru, Om Guru, Om Guru. Om Guru, Om Guru, Om Guru, Om. Om Guru, Om Guru, Om Guru,
Om, peace. Amen. Okay, my friends, we are continuing with our study of the Bhagavad Gita, which is really quite a marvelous, never-ending study. We are on chapter 6 of the Gita proper. The section of the book is called The True Yoga. So, chapter 6, verse 24 and 25. Let me go back to chapter 6, verse 23, because it explains what these verses are about. That state is known as yoga, the condition in which one becomes immune to any pain. The practice of yoga should therefore be followed resolutely with undaunted feeling. We talked about that one at great length last week. And then it goes on to say what that state is. Relinquishing without exception, and Swami puts without exception in italics, So it says, relinquishing, without exception, every self-willed longing, restraining mentally all sensory involvement in the world, patiently calming the intuitive intelligence, and absorbed in the self, the yogi, relinquishing all other thoughts, gradually attains perfect peace. You know, the saints have, the avatars have a revelation. The avatars, Krishna, Buddha, Christ, Paramhansa Yogananda, the ones who come, the distinguishing feature of an avatar, as opposed to merely a great saint, is not merely the state of their realization, because God realization can be attained in the course of a lifetime, or one can be a jivan mukta, which is the ego post has been dissolved, but not all karma is finished. These are all just words to me. I don't really know what any of this means from any actual experience. But one of the characteristic features of the avatar is that they come in to change the course of history. That's why I can say Krishna, Christ, Buddha, and we all know about them, even though there have been many other self-realized beings. But an avatar comes to change the course of history. He has a mission that, as Swami says, is not only qualitative but quantitative, and it's large. But the reality of that revelation of a true master looking at this world is they just see something that the rest of us don't see. And they see it so vividly and so clearly that they don't equivocate. They don't say maybe, they don't say take it a little bit. They just say that what you think of as happiness producing is actually producing suffering. And what you perceive as suffering is actually the route to happiness. In his prayers and whispers from eternity, Master, one of his whispers, one of his prayers is, teach me that the ways of virtue, though painful at the beginning, will be effortlessly liberating at the end, and the ways of vice, which appear so satisfying, will in the end be the pathway to misery. So when we first begin our long journey away from its home in God, we just simply perceive things differently than the masters say that they really are. We enjoy the body, we enjoy the ego, we enjoy the power it gives us, the pleasure it gives us. We enjoy the sense of separation from others, our self-aggrandizement, thinking ourselves special and unique. We fight with other people, we try to have power over other people. You see it happening all around us on the planet today. People are simply confused. And after enough lifetimes, and it takes quite a few, if we gradually begin to suffer enough that instead of asserting what the reality of things is, we begin to genuinely try to find out what is true. And when that longing is sincere enough, then gradually the ways of true understanding are open to us. And then we begin to understand, and what happens, we sort of get drawn in a little at a time. At first we sort of think we can practice a little of this teaching. We can sort of take the parts that we like and leave the parts that we don't. And that's the way God intended it. We can do that very nicely. I remember a woman came to our church and she was telling me how much she enjoyed many things that we were doing. She enjoyed the music, she enjoyed some of the talks, but she said this karma and reincarnation stuff, she just couldn't take it. My response to her is, I said, well, just ignore it. I said, every time I start saying it, just put your hands over your ears and make noise so you don't have to listen. And she seemed quite surprised. I said, you're finding inspiration from some of it. Don't worry about what you don't like. The inspiration itself will teach you. It'll take you wherever you want to go. So it is right and proper that we just begin to have little pieces of it. You know, in the Vedas themselves, in the great wealth of scripture from India, there's also, as I understand it, formulas for worldly success, even formulas for getting back at your enemies and things like that you'd think would not be included. And Swamiji said, well, if people can grow accustomed to looking to the scripture for what they want, then it will gradually clarify, their own experience will clarify it. So, because the power of the spiritual path, as self-realization, as it's truly taught, it is not that it's a dogma. It is guidelines that allow us to conduct the right experiment, and so that we can find out from the results that we get what is really true and what is not. But what happens to us, and I'll speak for myself in this context, I don't have any doubt about the truth of it, but I don't have experience of the complete truth of it. And so I can no longer repudiate anything that Master or Swamiji says to me, but nor can I entirely attest to it from my own experience. This is the long journey from beginning realization to final realization. I used to jokingly call it the icky middle. When you're too committed to give it up, but not deep enough to have the revelation that takes away all struggle. You know, we just have to keep climbing. I used to enjoy mountain climbing stories, you know, the real dramatic Everest, Annapurna, K2 kind of ones, the really big ones. And you would see, now there's a lot of films about it. It used to be you just had them in books. But you would see a certain point where you've gone too far to turn back, and the summit is still some distance away. And all we can do is just, we believe, you can believe in what you're doing. You can believe that you can make it to the summit. You believe in yourself, you believe in your equipment, you believe in your guide, you believe in the experience of others. You know that what's happening to you is what happens to people, and if you simply persevere, you know, you will reach that goal. So the scripture is to talk to us about this. And so in the verse before, Krishna has told us that we will become immune from pain. And that's a very promising thing. And how we do that is we relinquish without exception every self-willed longing. So we start with that. Sister Gyanamata put it simply when she said she gradually came to realize that she would have to give up everything. Even those things that she said were hers by right, or were right in themselves, and they were just concerning her. But insofar as we cling to any separate desire, then to that extent we are separated from the divine. It's very interesting. Master said to Swami that every desire, before God realization can come, every desire has to be fulfilled. We have to give up. We have to fulfill and let go of every desire. We have to know that nothing else will satisfy us. That's what's trying to be said here. It's not like, and we misunderstand this, we think that this is some kind of a punishment. The holding on is like this. We have to come into perfect alignment with that flow of divine grace. And that flow of divine grace completely dissolves any sense of separateness that we have, that we just know we are one with this greater reality, and that it is God's grace flowing through us at all times that gives us everything that we want. And if any piece of us holds on to, I just want this, I just want that, I just need this comfort, I just need this relationship, I just need this position, then by definition, we're taking something and we're separating ourselves off to here. This is what it says: without exception, every self-willed longing, restraining mentally all sensory involvement in the world. If we see this world as attractive to our human self, it's not that there's anything wrong with that. It's not like it's sin or evil. It's just that insofar as we are committed to it, then to that extent we are vibrating differently than this one power of spirit. Every so often when we are in complete harmony with the greater reality, we understand it. Because when you're in complete harmony with it, a friend of mine had a near-death experience. He whacked himself very hard on the back of the head and felt himself going up into the light, and he actually traveled far enough up the tunnel of light that he met a being of light there. And he described later, he said, it wasn't so much because what he experienced in the company of that being of light was, he said, that all other desires just completely evaporated. And it wasn't that he had to put them aside, as he put it. He said, in the vibration of absolute contentment that he felt in the company of that being of light, it was just impossible for any other vibration to intrude. And it gave him the perception of what the scriptures are all talking about when they say you have to relinquish without exception. He said, but what's so remarkable about it was, it wasn't that he had to use any discipline to relinquish. It was just the vibration of the being of light was so overwhelming that everything else just fell away of its own. A friend of mine talked to me about, she said she was traveling in India, and she was traveling on her own. And traveling on your own, she said, you become very careful. You always know where your passport is, you always know where your money is, you know where your few belongings that you're traveling with are, because you're completely responsible. And travel in India, especially the time she was talking about, could be very chaotic. And also there's people who are impoverished and will take advantage of the opportunity, some of them, to take what you have. So she talked about going to the ashram of a certain woman saint in India. And she talked about how when she walked into the ashram and into the darshan hall, and she saw the saint sitting there, she said she became so completely absorbed in the saint that she said she just walked away from all her belongings without the slightest remembrance even that they were there. She just walked away from them, went and sat at the foot of the saint and spent many hours there. She says it was only hours later, after the saint had left, that it even crossed her mind, that the one preoccupation she'd had the whole time when she was traveling that she'd never let go of, it left her of its own accord. There was another, what was the other? I was thinking of, give me a moment. Oh, I can't remember. But this is what they're really talking about. Now, the in-between stage of it is when we constantly make choices. That's what sadhana is. Sadhana is spiritual practice. And sadhana is much more than chanting, meditation, doing kriya, doing yoga postures, all the many things that we can do that we tend to think of as sadhana. Sadhana is the constant awareness of disciplining our attention away from that which is ego strengthening and toward that which is ego dissolving. And it's as simple as that. That's just simply what we're doing. We move whenever we are able to be aware of the choice, we move toward that which dissolves the ego. And these are the practices like japa, which is the continuous repeating of the name of God, or a mantra, or a chant within ourselves, that we, on a moment-by-moment, thought-by-thought basis, we make the choice that is ego-dissolving rather than ego-affirming. Because so much of our thought just revolves all the time about what I want, what I need, what I'm happy about, what I'm unhappy about. When I first read a book by Swami Vivekananda, it was the first book about self-realization that was handed to me. And I remembered three things from that book. And I had, the book made such a strong impression on me, and it was the beginning of the life I've lived ever since. The context of exactly how and when, I can't remember. What I remember essentially is the essence. And I remember three pieces of wisdom in that book. One of them was, what you are today is the result of what you did yesterday, and what you will be tomorrow is the result of what you're doing today. It was the law of karma explained. And whether he brought it to that or I brought it to that, that's what I realized. Oh, there is a cause and effect relationship. My own actions determine my state of consciousness, which is really what this was. That was one. The second was perfect love casts out all fear. I thought that was from Vivekananda. It turns out it's from St. Paul in the letters of Paul. Perfect love casts out all fear, that the opposite of fear is love. I knew that fear was the destructive factor in my life. I didn't understand that love was the opposite to it. And it's not like love, like I love a person. It's infinite love. It's when we understand how much God loves us, and when we begin to understand what it feels like to be in that divine romance, to offer that back, then we realize that we have no cause for fear. It's like everything happens within the will of God. God's will for us is always for our best interest. There is a wise, benevolent, infinite power that is actually the moving force in this world. So why would I ever be afraid? I would be afraid because I haven't relinquished without exception every self-willed longing. I'm still holding up, and I have allowed myself to have sensory involvement in this world, which is I'm worried about my body, I'm worried about my hunger, I'm worried about my pleasures, I'm just worried about all the things that I'm so involved in this world. What will happen to me if they're taken away? So because I know that I can lose what I want, I'm afraid. But if I understand God's love for me and the power of my love for God, then I have no reason to fear anymore. I learned this, I've been learning it for the last 50 years, but I heard it for the first time when I was 19. So it's more than 50 years now. And the third one was, don't think about yourself and you'll be happy. And that has also been very interesting. If we're not always checking to see how we feel, and you see all of this is ego affirming versus ego dissolving. That was so confusing for me because I was 19 years old, and I wasn't selfish, but I was always, I won't even say self-aware, self-concerned. I was always a little bit anxious about my own position in the world. And I was always checking to see what my own position in the world was. And I just didn't even know that I could surrender that self-concern and trust God. And then everything would be completely different. Very, very slowly, over the course of many years, I've at least come to understand the principle. I began to understand the principle, interestingly, when I very first lived at Ananda village, and I was given the responsibility, I came into the responsibility of running the kitchen for the guests and for the residents. And I didn't have much help. I was 24 years old, so I was pretty strong. I didn't have much help. I had to cook 3 meals a day, 6 days a week, and on the 7th day go to town and do 24 loads of laundry for all the residents and shop for the whole week and then bring everything back and unload it and all that work. I loved it, absolutely loved it. It's perhaps my favorite job ever. And I was so busy that I actually didn't have time to think about myself. And it was just like it gave me a picture of what that would feel like, because all my energy had to go outward to take care of others. And it was such a, it was so perfect for me because I was so exceedingly intellectual and mental. And cooking, I'd never cooked at all until I was doing this. Cooking is so unabstract, and everybody needs it, needs food. And when you're cooking for a group of people, somebody always likes it. That's what I gradually learned. People's tastes vary so widely that what one person may think of as unfortunate, another may think of as ambrosial. So people were always happy with what I did, and they always had to have what I did. So my energy, instead of being always asking about me, was automatically focused on others. And it just gave me an experience of just letting go and letting the flow of life take me, instead of my always trying to master it and guide it. I just didn't, there was no margin. You know, it had to be done, period. And so I just had to do it. And we begin to find this, oddly, this wonderful freedom in self-forgetfulness. So when he says, relinquishing without exception every self-willed longing, it's meant on a very subtle level. And if a little bit of the relinquishment of self-concern and desires and I have to have and fears, if even a little bit brings us great joy, at what point does it stop? You see, this is partly how we can understand the possibility of self-realization, which is we keep increasing our awareness by our life experience, and one is much more aware today than one was yesterday, or, well, apparently the Dalai Lama said, if you're going to try to measure your spiritual development, he said, never think of a unit of time less than 10 years. And I found that very, very interesting, because almost everyone who is sincere about their spiritual effort and has been working on it, if you think now and you think a decade ago, you can easily see where the growth has been. If you think today and yesterday, you might not be able to find it. If you think last week or last month, because we tend to think that spiritual growth is a straight line. Everybody's going in a straight line and it's really predictable, but it isn't. It's much more like the tide coming in and then the tide being interrupted by a hurricane or something like that. It's just all kinds of ups and downs as we sort of very gradually. It's more like a seed sort of busting out with all its different pieces. I live, where I live, there's a garden area outside, and I've been living in this house for at least 10, maybe 15 years almost now. And in the course of time, I've planted a few fruit trees here and there. And time tends to go faster and faster as you're older. And I was visiting the fruit trees now because it's spring. And I was noticing how strong they've become, rooted where they are, and how their trunks have gotten thicker. And when did it happen? And they've grown in lots of directions. It's not like it's one spear going up, just one monolith just heading for the sky. It's been growing in all different directions with all different twists and different kinds of expressions, and some of the branches are thicker than others. And I was just sort of marveling how life expresses itself. It's not a theoretical experiment. It begins to evolve. And so our spiritual understanding just begins to evolve. And understanding much more now than I did 10 years ago, and much more now than I did 50 years ago. Like, is there an end point to this? When he says relinquishing without exception, and I say, but what about this? But what about that? But if it's proven beneficial up until now, why would it not prove beneficial to the very end? And this is the process of the spiritual path. So now we are restraining mentally all sensory involvement in the world. It's not, we have to live, we have to eat, we have to sleep, we have to do all the things we have to do, but it's being involved in it. It's defining ourselves by it. It's depending upon it. I have a few friends who are in rather dire circumstances for various reasons, where they don't have much control over the circumstances of their lives, just bad luck and ill health and things like that. And I often try to measure my desires, my dependence on having things my way, with what if. What if I just couldn't? What if I became paralyzed? What if I became impoverished? What if I became imprisoned? Do I want to be there trying still to make things happen my way? But what's the difference? I was very moved in a book called The Pastor's Wife. It's written by Sabina Wurmbrand. It's a very heart-rending read, so I recommend it, but it's not for the faint-hearted. She was the wife, I think she's passed away, of Richard Wurmbrand, who was a Christian pastor in communist Romania, and he was imprisoned, and eventually she was imprisoned also for a time, for their faith, for no other reason. And Sabina suffered in the prison. It was impossible not to. It was horrible circumstances. But she always had her inner life. And even if much that she would have wanted to have had on the outside was taken away from her, she still had a powerful inner world in which she related to God and to Jesus. And so she was not utterly bereft, although at times, of course, the pain of her circumstance would overcome her, but her inner strength would always rise again, and which allowed her, when she was finally released from prison, to be able to let go completely of the darkness she had experienced. It was interesting, actually. Richard Wurmbrand came to speak in the town of Grass Valley, which is right near where Ananda Village is. And that would have been in the mid-70s. And we all knew about him, Swami too, admired him greatly from a distance. And he was an evangelical Christian, and he was being sponsored by some church in town. And about 30 of us from Ananda went to hear him speak. And it was an interesting setup, because the way they had designed their church, there was a dais, a podium, and it was in the wall between two rooms. So it could be used to face into what was their fellowship hall for sort of informal things, and then it could also face into the sanctuary when the pastor was preaching. It was a simple church, and that was their economical way of doing it. But there were so many of us, and it wasn't a large church, so they put all of us in the fellowship hall, and their congregation was in the sanctuary side. And Richard Wurmbrand was there, and he would speak sometimes facing the church congregation and then sometimes facing us. And it was like he was speaking spontaneously from his own intuition. And when he would speak to the congregation, the church congregation side, he would talk in a much more conventional way about Jesus and the Bible. And then when he would turn and talk to us, he would talk more about the inner experience, the inner communion, the transcendent power of Jesus. Just it was very uplifting. Now, with him at the same time, there was another man, another Christian who'd also been imprisoned, who was also coming to share his experience. The two men could not have been more different, because Richard Wurmbrand had lived with Jesus through that whole experience. And when he came out, he was able to just put that experience aside because he was just still with Jesus. But the other man, you could see, had become defined by his suffering. And he testified in the best and most uplifting way he could, but their consciousness was so different. Because one understood, Richard Wurmbrand made it clear to us that he completely understood yoga, although he would never have said the word. His philosophy from experience had been to discover how to become immune from pain, just as Krishna has promised. He found his justification in the teachings of Jesus, because all masters agree. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and where is the kingdom of God? The kingdom of God is within. And this is what Richard Wurmbrand could say to us because we understood. Going back to his wife, the pastor's wife, she talked about, because it was communism and it was such a terrible time, people were being arrested for all sorts of things. And she said the saddest women in the prison with her were the women who were socialites, had been wealthy, and for some reason perhaps they were the spouses of government officials who fell out of favor, and then they ended up in prison. Often, she said, they'd been arrested from a fancy restaurant or from a dinner party and showed up in prison in their evening clothes. And because it was such a barbaric situation, they just simply had to, their only clothes they had were what they came in on, and so they were there in their evening dress, months or years later, conceivably. But she said they were helpless because they had no inner life. It had never crossed their mind to relinquish self-willed longings. They lived entirely by self-willed longings. I'll go shopping, I'll get my hair done, I'll flirt with this person. And they were completely involved in a sensorial way in the world. And when all of those were taken away, they had no other reality. And Sabina Wurmbrand just talked about how much compassion she felt for them, because they had nothing to live for. And that's what makes us the opposite of immune from pain, because this world is just ever changing. Right at this moment, this is being filmed in the middle of April of 2022, and the country of Ukraine has been invaded by the country of Russia. And Ukraine is a modern country. They were living a life not dissimilar to the one I'm living at this point. And just in a matter of weeks, they're a war zone. All of it has been taken from them. What would become of you, what would become of me, if all of it were taken from us? And maybe it will be, maybe it won't be. But some part of us always knows how vulnerable we are. This was my childhood. It was an interesting dilemma that I always felt growing up until I met self-realization at 19 and Swami Kriyananda at 22. I was a perfectly happy person. I have a, relatively speaking, light center of gravity, and my set point is pretty cheerful, as a rule. I certainly suffer, everybody suffers, but my set point is pretty cheerful. But I was obsessed from my whole life, really, until I found self-realization, and that's why I found it. I wanted to be happy. And as I said to Swami later, it was so peculiar because I wasn't unhappy, but I had this desire to be happy. Swami said, well, you remember past lives. You remember how vulnerable happiness is unless it's anchored in some inner reality. And I intuitively remembered, I presume, from past lives. It's spoken in the commentary here about how in the astral world the soul remembers whatever spiritual lessons it has learned. And when it reincarnates, it begins, those seeds germinate again. So those seeds germinated as soon as I was born. And I was on this quest because, of course, I wasn't realized in any previous lifetime. I was in the middle of the quest whenever that lifetime ended, so I was born with the intensity of the quest. But having been born in the West, I couldn't figure out what to do with it until that Vivekananda book was given to me. But it manifested as this concern that I had to find out how to be happy, even though paradoxically I was happy, because I remembered. This is what Sabina was talking about. There's a certain point at which we begin to remember. So then, after mentally restraining all sensory involvement in the world, we are patiently calming the intuitive intelligence. The intuitive intelligence is the intuition. That's what Swami calls it. It's calm feeling combined with calm reason. Calm is the key word here. We're not compelled by self-willed longing, and we're not enamored and tossed about by our sensory involvement in the world. We are patiently calming the intuitive intelligence so that we can perceive directly what is happening in this world. Because you see, our senses persuade us and our longings persuade us. Reason follows feeling, Master said. It's a very important thing to realize. Whatever we are emotionally biased to want or to believe, then our thoughts will follow. And that's why sometimes we get so caught up in an idea or a belief or an accusation or a sense of being mistreated, whatever it might be. And then somehow that wave will pass and we'll just realize, what was I thinking? What was I so upset about? Because we've finally calmed the intuitive intelligence and we can know what's true. But the word patiently is also there. And that's a whole lot of what the spiritual path is about. There's the word tapasya, which generally means austerity or sacrifice or discipline. But another definition of tapasya is actually patience, which is to calmly do whatever is needed in order to achieve the goal that you're going for. And the reason we can't be disciplined in what we're doing is because we become impatient. We become impatient for the satisfaction of a certain whatever it might be, or we become impatient for the result and we think the result isn't coming, so we break our discipline. But to patiently work to calm our feelings and awaken our intuitive intelligence. I had a very interesting learning experience in an extremely mundane way, but it's really served me. There was a certain point in this dwelling early on when I decided I wanted to put curtains up on the windows. I subsequently took them all down, but for a period of time I had these curtains up. And I had to put up curtain rods. Curtain rods had to be put up. And for some reason, even though I'm not at all skilled at home repair, I just decided I would do it myself. And so I went through this several days of effort to put up these curtain rods and get the curtains up and all of that. Ultimately succeeded. They weren't a highly professional job, and I often put big screws in the wall and then had to take them out, then had to fill in the holes, then had to repaint where I made the mistake, and then try it again. But what happened is from that I learned something very interesting, that you can accomplish anything by the patient application of willpower. And that's the phrase that I came to, the patient application of willpower. And it was a very graphic learning because I had no skill. But by the patient application of willpower, I managed to accomplish what I really wanted to accomplish. And when later I was called upon to write several books, including the most important one, the last one I wrote, which was called Light Bearer, which is a very big book about my life with Swami. You know, it took me several years to write, and then in the very end, not continuous work, but intermittent work, and then at the end, much of a year spent many months in seclusion, just the patient application of willpower. And at that point I finally understood, and I had that quality in me, and I knew all I had to do was just not quit. And I just had to, but I had to patiently apply that willpower. And, you know, sometimes it would be like, and I never set for myself, just as the way my mind works. Other people work differently, but I never set for myself that I was going to have a certain amount done by a certain point, or that I was going to be finished by such a point, because trying to meet deadlines worked contrary to my understanding, which is that I just keep patiently applying willpower to this. And in the end, it will be done. And in the end, it was done. And everything about it, that is, when, you know, unfortunate mental or emotional aberrations reveal themselves in my heart, when self-willed longings or mental involvement in sensory experience, or the intuitive intelligence is completely agitated instead of calm, when all those things reveal themselves to me about my own spiritual progress, the patient application of willpower, which is the pasya, which is we just keep trying. And if we look back over 10-year increments, we see that somehow it has worked. You know, somehow it has worked. I love being older. I do not look forward to being young again, unless God will give me this memory of the true nature of life. This is a hope that I continually remind Divine Mother. So, patiently calming the intuitive intelligence and absorbed in the self, the capital S, self. The yogi, relinquishing all other thoughts, gradually attains perfect peace. Isn't that a wonderful promise? Absorbed in the self, relinquishing all other thoughts. You see, it all gets really very simple at a certain point. As a friend once said, you're either thinking about God or you're not. And that doesn't mean that you can't, well, write a book, for example. When I was writing a book, I had to think about the book. I had to think about everything related to the book. I had to think about Swami's life. I had to think about where the paragraphs began and ended. I mean, there were countless things. But what happens is, when we're concentrating, and we all know this, if you're really concentrating on something, and if you're concentrating upward, In other words, that as Swami put it, you put your attention at the spiritual eye and you allow yourself to be guided. And that's what I began to learn back in the summer of 71, when I was just cooking vegetarian food for 30 people 3 times a day. There was a flow of energy that I stepped into. I wasn't, well, Swamiji said something, he said it actually a number of years ago, but he was talking about the times in which we're living, even right today. It's extremely applicable to world events in this moment. And Swamiji was talking about the coming of Dwapara Yuga. Dwapara Yuga is a rising age of energy that this planet is going through right now. And as the yugas are explained, there's a wonderful book called The Yugas, published by Crystal Clarity, written by Joseph Selby and David Steinmetz, highly recommended. The rising and falling ages on planet Earth are an astronomical phenomenon, not astrological, astronomical. It's a physical aspect of our creation, of the solar system, that we move closer and then farther away. Planet Earth does, our whole solar system does, closer and then farther away from the center of the galaxy of which we are a part. And there's a dynamic energy center at the center of the galaxy, and the closer the orbit of planet Earth moves toward the center of the galaxy, the more refined and magnetic energy comes, and the more civilization in the consciousness of all people who are inhabiting this planet becomes more and more refined. And then as the orbit shifts and we move away, then the civilization on this planet becomes more and more dense and less refined. Now, as Swami writes in these commentaries, there are many inhabited planets. And when we go to the astral world, we do not necessarily come back to Earth. We're not earthlings, except temporarily. To be an earthling is to be in a physical body on this planet. We're not earthlings in our divine nature. So we step in and out of physical bodies each incarnation, birth, middle age, old age, and death, and then our consciousness goes back to the astral world, and the energy pattern, the consciousness pattern in the spine goes with us, and then that pattern, which contains our remaining karma, after a time will compel us to take physical birth again. And we will take physical birth on whatever planet is at the right stage of the yuga cycle to be the right learning environment for us at that particular time in that particular place. So we are now shifting from Kali Yuga into Dwapara. It's a tumultuous transition when more and more energy begins to come to this planet, and right now it's accelerating. We can see it with technology, we can see it with the way we move through the world, we can see it as how rapidly things are changing. That energy is sweeping in because we're at the beginning, we're at the ascending, we're at the first flush of energy. So the way Swami described it is that many people are feeling this energy flooding the planet, and everyone is responding to it according to their own vibratory level. Now, the energy that's flooding in has the potential to raise our awareness. It has the potential to expand our consciousness in all the ways that really matter. Compassion, kindness, all these things. Relinquishing self-will, instead of becoming more involved in the sensory world, becoming more refined in our appetites and in our enjoyment of life. Just like Sabina Wurmbrand drew her joy from her relationship with Christ not from her new hairdo and her new dress and her manicure and her new furniture, anything like that. I mean, a level like that, it's not that it's not that it's evil, it's just limited. It's intensely limited. And the more expansive we can be, the more joy we have. It's as simple as that. But people feel this energy coming in. And some people on the planet are evil, because there are such things as evil, which is to find your pleasure in the suffering of others, being willing to cause others to suffer if you think it gives you something that you want, deliberately enjoying that. And as Swami once said, if that's not evil, I don't know what would be. You know? So people feel energy coming, and people of refinement sense in that energy the possibility of cooperating with the divine flow and elevating our consciousness and expanding our sympathies. People of grosser, and depending how gross their consciousness, meaning less subtle, and also materialistic, and also perhaps evil. They want to master that energy and recognize that the possibilities of personal power are even greater. Personal indulgence is even greater. And they're trying to master that energy, and it's expressing, Swami said, in sensuality, extreme materialism, and violence. Just literally in violence. I have the power now to get what I want. That's what we see going on all around us right now. You know, people have political power, they have military power, some of them have technological weaponry, and they feel this, what to them feels gratifying, this ever-swelling egoic power over this world. And with that coming in energy, they're running rampant. And it's highly unfortunate. However, those of us who from the astral world, when we had the opportunity to make the decision, and it's not made with the ego mind, it's the soul's wisdom, and it's the vibration of the chakras, which is the unlearned lesson. You can find classes on my YouTube channel about the chakras. I highly recommend. Karma, reincarnation, and the chakras, and the yugas. If you can understand these concepts, really understand these concepts, you have a template that can make sense out of this crazy world. So I highly recommend it. But when we were between our incarnations and we were living in our astral self, where our consciousness was still there, the vibration of our awareness was there, and our soul nature was guiding us, and our guardian angels and our guru, and however all those forces work. I have an intuitive feeling about it, but I can't speak of it from experience. But I know that we joyously and eagerly embrace the opportunity that our next incarnation would give us, because the soul is always happy, because it knows it's going to learn more karmic lessons. It doesn't suffer like the ego suffers. It just knows that we're on a pathway to freedom, and even if we have to suffer for a time, we're going to learn. But we chose this. We knew it was a good idea because of this very fact, that this energy is coming into the world, and there's going to be, there is, and Master said there would be an increasing polarization, in which those trying to use this energy for self-aggrandizement, for violence, and for evil, and those of us who recognize that this energy is meant to create, to lift mankind into an ever more joyous and free state of being. And perfect love casts out all fear. So those of light consciousness can be made anxious by the seeming power of those in dark consciousness. And where I live at this moment, my life is allowed to continue, but I can see just on the other side of the world, which is not far away at all now, people's lives have been totally exploded, literally. And everything is changed. So, relinquishing without exception every self-willed longing, restraining mentally my sensory involvement in the world, patiently calming the intuitive intelligence, not the worried mind, the one that, what about me, what's going to happen, what about them, even compassion. Just we can feel deep compassion and a great desire to help. We can weep for the suffering of others, but we don't have to be afraid, because perfect love casts out fear. And absorbed in the thought of the self, the yogi, relinquishing all other thoughts, gradually comes to perfect peace. So, chapter 6, verse 26. Just a moment, did I lose something here? Yes, no, I didn't. Each time the fickle, wavering mind wanders from its course, let him withdraw it and redirect it toward the task of bringing it under control. There it is. And it doesn't say if the fickle mind wanders. It doesn't say if. It says each time the fickle, wandering mind wanders from its course, let him withdraw it and redirect it toward the task of bringing it under control. A young friend of mine had a mild interest in the spiritual path, but expressed it to me this way, that they were afraid if they got interested in the spiritual path, the practices I follow, that they would not be able to fulfill the multitudinous worldly desires that they had. I offered a counter argument which did not carry the person because it wasn't their destiny. But I said, what is the greatest obstacle to the achievement of the goals you set for yourself? And he answered after some consideration, he said, myself, my own limitations. I said, so what we're really talking about is we're talking about self-mastery. That anything that leads us to greater mastery over the fickle, wavering mind is going to allow us to achieve whatever goals we set, whatever those goals might be. Now, the Gita is talking about the ultimate goal of all existence, which is the yogi becomes immune to pain and free of all restless everythingness. But even little practice of this teaching, Krishna says, will free us from dire fears and colossal sufferings, because it's all moving in the direction of self-mastery, and self-mastery, the small s, mastering the little self so that we can keep our consciousness always on the infinite self. So each time the fickle, I love that word fickle. Of course, the Gita was not written in English, so all of these are translations from Sanskrit words, but fickle is a really interesting word. And fickle is, this is what I want now, but maybe tomorrow I'll want something else, and I'm totally committed to you, but actually I've changed my mind, and now I'm not going to be. And it's just, day by day. A friend of mine who was a very skilled educator, and he was giving parents and teachers also, but parents primarily, advice about how to work with teenagers. And one of the things he said, that one of the characteristics of teenagers is, you might say they have a short memory, but one of the characteristics is they're exploring identities, values, causes, and so a teenager will often become completely committed to something today, and then tomorrow won't remember that they were committed to it. Or they'll a few days later, they'll be committed to something that's contradictory to what they were committed to before. And he said one of the things that you have to do with teenagers is you have to take them seriously. Each time they have a commitment, because it is for them in that moment the totality of things. And if you mock their commitment, it weakens their self-esteem and their willpower. But all of us have this, the mind itself, the untrained mind, it's very fickle. It's passionate about this, and then it forgets about it and gets passionate about the other one. And fickle is just is the lack of tapasya, the lack of the patient application of willpower to really develop a deep skill or a deep interest. And the mind itself is just fickle. It's interested here, it's interested there, it's attracted in this way, it's attracted in that way. And the world that we live in today encourages us to be fickle. And I don't just mean the social structure and the values, but it's just like it's always flashing a new reality in front of us. And, fashions change. What was popular today is not popular tomorrow. And it's just, it's the opposite of what we really want. Each time the fickle, wavering mind wanders from its course. Now, what a verse like that tells us is, just relax, we're no different from anyone else. This is the project. The mind is fickle, the mind wavers. And what he says wanders from its course, and its course in this case is toward God realization, but its course is also toward simply the act of being able to focus on a goal and persevere until we get to it. That's where I come back to the patient application of willpower. I remember, this is one of my earliest memories. I was probably a toddler. I probably had language, but I'm not sure I even had language. I was small. And I had this toy shelf. And in memory, this toy shelf was about 4 feet tall and about 12 feet long. And it was stuffed with toys. Now, in reality, first of all, my parents never buried me under material things to that extent. So I presume it was probably a very small toy shelf, but in my world it loomed very large. And I know that it was full of toys. And I had this impulse that I was going to clean out my toy shelf. Don't ask me why. But I got the impulse. And I remember that I started by pulling absolutely everything out and piling it in the middle of the room. And then I lost interest in the project because I was a toddler and I had a fickle, wavering mind. I still have a fickle, wavering mind. I'm just a little better at disciplining it, but it's still a fickle, wavering mind, and it always has to be brought back on course. So somehow or another, in the course of things, my mother became aware of the fact that I had dumped everything I had onto the floor, and then I had abandoned the project. And being a very focused and a conscious mother, she brought me back and sat me down there and told me that I had to put it all away. And I remember sitting there, and of course, I was an emotional person because I was an emotional person. I am an emotional person. And I remember being completely absorbed in the tragic unfairness of being asked to put all this stuff away. And I remember picking up the toys, and you know how kids do this fake sort of crying? And I remember going, and then I remember very slowly putting it over toward there and then dropping it as if it was such a heavy weight, then collapsing back and picking up another one with the same. And I also remember that some part of my awareness said, for heaven's sakes, girl, just put the toys back on the shelf. It was just like, there's always these dual realities. And, being so young, but of course the soul is ageless. Just because my body was 3 or 4 or whatever it was, I was fully myself. I mean, where would myself be except inside of me? I was there. I didn't have language. I didn't have context. But I was the same person that I am right now. But I was, the fickle, wavering mind just had me captured. Just bring it back on course. Tapasya, patience. Maybe I wanted to go run and do something else, but if I just put my mind to it, And this is what raising children is about, actually. Not all parents, unfortunately, really understand this. You training them the patient application of willpower. You can do it. The fickle, wavering mind, every time that you see, each time that it expresses its fickleness and its waveringness, just bring it back on course. I didn't learn this as a child. I only learned it very painfully as an adult. I'm certainly not free, but I've progressed. Let him withdraw it from the wrong course and redirect it toward the task of bringing it under control. And this is why all pursuits, all efforts where you discipline yourself to accomplish a goal ultimately serve us. And this is why we have so many desires that appear to be unrelated to our spiritual life, but are exactly the right karmic circumstances to develop necessary skills, so as we progress through this incarnation or future incarnation, the fundamental understanding of how to do things will be in place. So, there was a friend of mine, he was a PhD, he was getting a PhD in physics at Stanford University nearby. And he also lived here with us, and he was very interested in the spiritual path. And he came to me one day, and he was a little concerned. He said he has such a passion for his academic studies and for the physics that he's learning about. He said he can go to his desk or wherever he was studying at the university. He can sit down in the morning, and then he'll look up and realize that it's already night. And he won't even know where the time has gone. And he was concerned that this kind of absorption was contrary to his spiritual practice. I said, my friend, you should thank God every day for that. Because you see, it's the opposite of the fickle, wavering mind. It was given over to something that caused him to forget time, space, and all willful self-concern in this flow of energy that was moving creatively through him, that was just dissolving all sense of self, teaching him discipline, teaching him focus, teaching him the patient application of willpower, all of these characteristics. So the karmic inclinations that we have, rather than being our enemies in many circumstances, if it's expanding our awareness, not contracting it. This goes without saying. Common sense has to be used here. But in a weird way, even wrong action, if it trains our willpower, can actually, in the end, be a stepping stone to right use of that willpower. And so even powerful evil may actually be the last stage before that is turned to good, because power has been developed. And this is where Swami, Master, said the same. Somebody with energy to make big mistakes is often far more advanced than someone, as Swami said, who is not really saintly. They just don't have enough energy to sin, is how he put it. They appear to be pious, but they're not really pious. They just haven't energized their delusions. They're just low energy in everything. So even to have energized your delusions with willpower and determination is often a more advanced stage than looking good, but it's all still in front of you because you haven't developed any self-mastery. So sometimes the karmic things that just compel us are God-given because they're going to teach us. The desire to marry, the desire to have children, the desire to have a beautiful home, the desire to have great wealth, the desire even to have status in the world will often be the activating incentive for us to learn to master the fickle, wavering mind. There was a story often told about Sri Ramakrishna, and he lived in a temple near Calcutta at the end of the 1800s, and the society was more much more conservative at that time, and the acting on stage was not something that women of refinement did. In fact, sometimes it was all men playing the parts of women, but then this actor, Girish Ghosh was his name. He was a disciple of Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna was an avatar. And Girish started bringing women into the theater and women into his plays, but high caste women would not appear on the stage, so he got low caste women, sometimes even prostitutes, to become actresses, because they had no status in society and it was a better job for them than the one they had. And so some of these people became quite talented, artistically talented with singing and dancing and acting, but they were still considered low caste. And Ramakrishna himself was a very high caste, and many of the people around him were high caste. Every society, as Master said, has its particular evil. And the caste system at that time in India was India's particular way of inflicting suffering on everybody. So Girish would sometimes bring his acting troupes to visit his guru, Ramakrishna, and so there would be these women and men who were not considered to be necessarily very respectable, but Ramakrishna would welcome them and relate to them all and celebrate with them. And then afterwards, some of the more staid and narrow-minded people would criticize Ramakrishna. Why do you associate with those low caste people? And his answer was perfect. He said, now, he said, the God they worship is music and art and theater and drama, he said. And so perhaps you think that, it would be better to worship the God of Kali or, the God of the Vedas. He said, that's the God they worship now. He said, but they know how to worship. And that was how he praised them. They know how to worship. And this, as the God they worship elevates, as they become more refined, they know how to worship. And so that's what we're trying to understand. We need to learn how to concentrate and to master ourselves and to give ourselves fully to whatever it is that God has put in front of us for us to accomplish. I recently heard an author giving advice on how to become a good author to high school students, and the phrase he used was, he said, when a young student asked him, how do I become a successful author? He said, excellence is a habit. I would give him credit, but I don't know who he was. I just heard him on the radio. Excellence is a habit. That's become just a magnificent phrase in my mind. It's like we always have to strive for excellence, because in the act of achieving excellence, whatever it is that we're doing, we will master the fickle, wavering mind. And we will learn to patiently calm our intuitive intelligence. We will learn, in other words, how to worship, how to be devoted. And then as we progress through life experience, going from fulfillment to fulfillment, then we will begin to understand more and more deeply what is a worthy object for us to worship. But we will know how to worship. This is what the Gita is trying to tell us. Let him withdraw it and redirect it toward the task of bringing it under control. 627. The yogi who has completely calmed his mind, whose passions are at rest, and who is freed from every impurity, truly attains oneness with the Spirit and supreme blessedness. The wonderful thing about the Gita is the promise is so extraordinary, isn't it? It's not even just a little peace of mind. It's we will attain supreme blessedness. Swamiji said when he first awoke, he had a profound experience walking on the beach when he was 22. And he began to understand the nature of the Spirit, the nature of the divine, and he began to understand the purpose of life, was to be more in tune with the divine qualities. And he resolved that he would leave everything and he would go to South America and become a hermit, because he thought he could live cheaply in South America. And he just wanted, he was tormented by this lack of meaning and this lack of clarity and this lack of understanding of truth. And he was willing to give up everything and go live as a hermit just to find a little peace of mind, a little calmness within himself. Then he found Autobiography of a Yogi. And in reading Autobiography of a Yogi, and he was on his, he was making his plans to go off and be a hermit, then he read Autobiography of a Yogi. And he'd been willing to renounce everything, as he put it, for a little peace of mind. And then from Autobiography of a Yogi, from Master, he learned that far from just a tiny drop of peace, he could have supreme blessedness, eternal freedom, everlasting joy. And the promise of that, offered by one who spoke the truth, gives us the power, to do the tapasya and to exert the willpower. And each time the fickle, wavering mind wanders off course, to reach out and bring it back, because we know where we are going. And we know that the destination is worth every effort it requires to get there. So, my friends, God bless you.